Hi, boys and girls. This is Ms. Kathy. I'm so happy you've joined me today for another story just for you. Chapter 2, Saving Captain Morgan. What do you mean it's gone? Jenny gulped. We were only away for a minute. Just what I said. It's gone, DeeDee answered, the sound of worry in her voice. Do you see it anywhere around here? Jenny shook her head. It couldn't have just walked off. It has to be here. Did you see me carry it into the other room or outside? DeeDee asked. Maybe I did and don't remember. Jenny shook her head again. We looked at it in this room for just a few minutes, she said. It has to be here. But after 20 minutes of searching, they had to give up. The Bible just wasn't there. Jenny saw tears in DeeDee's eyes. She put her arm around her friend. It's not your fault, DeeDee, Jenny said. I was with you all the time, and I know that we left it right here. DeeDee sobbed. But that Bible is so important to our family. What are we going to do? Do about what? Mrs. Adams stood in the doorway. When DeeDee saw her mother, the tears flowed freely. DeeDee, what's happened? DeeDee was crying so hard she couldn't speak, so Jenny tried to explain. When we came back, the Bible was gone. There, it's okay, Mrs. Adams said to DeeDee, trying to get her to stop crying. I have to admit that your story is strange, but the Bible couldn't have gone very far. She stroked DeeDee's hair as DeeDee's tears slowed. I'm sure it will show up around here somewhere, Mrs. Adams said, as she sat down on the couch beside DeeDee. Let's see. Has Jenny heard the story of this old house yet? Jenny shook her head. Just that it used to be a boarding house. Is there more than that? Mrs. Adams smiled. Much more. In fact, you are sitting in one of the most historical houses in Mill Valley. Chances are, however, you haven't heard much about it in your history books. DeeDee's great-great-grandfather, Abraham Hartford, wasn't a very nice man, and he got involved in a lot of bad things. But when he became a Christian, he decided that he wanted to tell others about Jesus. But some of his enemies still tried to hurt him and his family. They even burned his house down. Finally, in 1904, he moved here and became a preacher, the first black preacher in Mill Valley. Times were hard back then, especially for a black minister. People were poor, and his church couldn't afford to pay him very much. Fortunately, he had a little money saved up from his life before. He used it to buy this boarding house. What kind of people stayed here? Jenny asked. All kinds, Mrs. Adams said. Grandpa Abraham never turned anyone away. At that time, there were a lot of hard feelings between white people and black people in town. This was considered the part of town where black people lived. But Grandpa Abraham allowed all kinds of people to live in his house. That's why the mystery of Captain Morgan happened here instead of somewhere else. Jenny and DeeDee looked at each other. Mystery? DeeDee asked, no longer crying. What mystery? Mrs. Adams smiled and went on. In those days, a bad man named Captain Morgan did a lot of business on the river near here. He made his own whiskey to sell, then used the money to buy guns. He sold the guns to robbers and other criminals down south. He made a lot of money, but he made a lot of enemies at the same time. One night, there was a big fight in town, and Captain Morgan got shot. He dragged himself to the boarding house here and asked Grandpa Abraham for help. Grandpa took him in, even though the town would have been very angry to have a white man in this boarding house on the black side of town. Wow, Jenny said. What happened then? Captain Morgan's enemies looked all over for him, Mrs. Adams said, but everyone knew that Captain Morgan had always been extra mean to the black people in town. His enemies knew that he would never come to this part of town to find help. Captain Morgan was smart, DeeDee said. Yes, his hiding place protected him for a while, Mrs. Adams said. He hid at the boarding house for several weeks. Then one night he just disappeared. You mean he ran away? DeeDee asked. Well, most people thought he ran away, but there were some reports of strange lights down by the river the night he disappeared. Some people think his enemies finally caught up with him, killed him, and threw him in the river. Wow, Jenny said. And he hid out in this house? Mrs. Adams nodded. In this very house, in the room at the end of the hall upstairs. Wow! The girls were silent for a moment. Finally, DeeDee spoke. If he just disappeared one night, I wonder if he left anything here. Well, you two can check the house out in the next few days, Mrs. Adams said. Just let me know if you find anything. The girls jumped up and ran to the stairway. Just keep your eyes open for that Bible, Mrs. Adams shouted after them.
The story you have heard today is a chapter of The Shoebox Kids, Book 7, The Clue in the Secret Passage, written by Glenn Robinson edited and created by Jerry D. Thomas, and used with permission from the Pacific Press Publishing Association. If you're interested in any other books published by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, please visit AdventistBookCenter.com or call 1-800-765-6955.
This podcast is a production of the Carolina Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.